which is good. Anyway, basically, before 1967, which was before all of you were born, I think I'm safe to say that, all of you but me. Basically, we had public broadcasting stations. The government was licensing stations in various cities, but there was no sort of organization. There was no grouping of them. They were all just individual stations that had a license, and they were doing good things, and not much news, because news was too expensive. So it was sort of local public affairs. Some courses. I mean, many of these stations were owned by universities. AU had one. Howard still has theirs. And then churches own them. And in some cases, there were local organizations that owned them that were just trying to do, good work. So they were all independently owned, independently funded, and most of them were struggling mightily in terms of survival. Most of the staffs were underpaid, if not paid at all. In 1967, basically the government established this thing called CPB, or Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Hopefully you looked at that on the assignment. It was a political move, plain and simple. It was the government, many in the government were responding to the big three commercial networks, and there were only three at that time, and their coverage of this unpopular thing called the Vietnam War, or conflict. And they didn't like the way the news was reporting it, because they were reporting bad things happening, and to many in the government, it was inciting the public to not like the war and not like the soldiers and not like them as politicians. And that's something they don't like. So they kept thinking, oh, wouldn't it be nice if we had something like the BBC where we could control it? And they wouldn't air any of this nasty stuff because we wouldn't let them. Well, that train sailed, that ship sailed or whatever along many years ago when we established our system of television, and many other countries like Britain established theirs, and ours was based on the free market and individual ownership, etc., which led to independence in terms of what was broadcast. And our freedom of the press and all that kind of stuff, which we hold dear, but politicians sometimes say, I like the freedom when they're saying this thing, but I don't like necessarily when they're saying this. So they said, well, if we have a public broadcasting system that we sort of control, maybe we'll be able to at least get some counter-programming out there. So basically, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting did this study, and in 1967, and then in 1969, they established what we have now, the Public Broadcasting Service, which was set up as a national co-op, basically owned by all of the stations, the member stations out there across the country, with the idea to try to establish some standards of national programming in the public sphere, both in terms of news, much of which was originating out of Washington and WETA here, and then other kinds of programming which was coming along. As it turned out, the first successful program on a national basis had nothing to do with the news, but had to do with a big yellow bird and some other fuzzy creatures, was Sesame Street. Out of WNET in New York, it was so popular there, basically, they said, well, this is something we can do nationwide pretty easily, and it expanded and was very successful, obviously. So it's not, what we have today is very similar to that. That basic structure has not really changed any in terms of this co-op sort of function. We still have CPB. They stayed in business, as government agencies tend to do. They were only set up to do this one thing, and then they stuck around because they sort of are the way the politicians in the government sort of control PBS through CPB. CPB still gives them a big chunk of their budget every year. You probably noticed that, hopefully, of their operating budget. And the board of CPB is appointed by some by the president, some by the Congress. So there's a political element to that as well. So they still have the purse string controls that they wanted. The member stations are roughly 350 some odd today, depending on how you count, but 350 is a good number to keep in mind. Many of them are still small and local and supported by local organizations, but then we have some that are, locally owned WETA like here, which is huge. And we have others that are statewide, like Maryland Public Television. Oregon has a similar statewide system. Yes?
I'm sorry, so CPB just provides funding, right?
They provide funding, yes.
They don't do programming at all?
They provide grants for programming.
Okay.
So hopefully, I think I had one of my questions was to look for that. So yeah, they have programming grants. And actually it's still the case. I mean, they have money to give away, which they generally don't give all of it away every year, because they're pretty picky about what programs they pick, because they also get second-guessed a lot by the politicians. So, anyway, the member stations do general local programming during most of the day, local events, local things like that, and they're still basically at the mercy of money from the local sponsors, or the local corporations, or the individuals, the pledge drives you see all the time, that kind of thing, still are the bedrock of public broadcasting. What changed, though, in terms of money is that the member stations all pay basically dues up to the national co-op. And that is based on the market size. It's pretty much based on market size. Somewhat of their coverage. If there are two stations in a particular market, they divide that up in terms of what would be logical to expect that particular station to contribute to the national fund. And this moved, this was until the mid-'80s. This was pretty much the way it went. And what happened basically in the 80s was we started getting, the real dominance or development of cable. We'll talk about cable more next class, but particularly things like Discovery coming along that basically took on sort of the programming mantle that PBS had been trying to establish in terms of nonfiction, factual, unbiased programming. Very sort of with lots of journalistic integrity. And when Discovery first started out in the 80s, they had the same thing, and they were actually showing a lot of the same programs that they had licensed. So basically it started really cutting into PBS's ratings. And even though PBS says that they don't follow the rating, they don't care about ratings, it's basically BS, because they do, because they also rely on corporate sponsors, and corporate sponsors get excited when there are ratings and people watching. In other words, we don't want to underwrite a program, sponsor a program, if nobody's going to see it. It's just not, there's a limit to the sort of their corporate do-goodness. So the PBS, CPB people, fretted and fussed over all this, and then they realized that the big advantage that the large networks, national networks had, was that they were promoting programming that was happening at the same time everywhere across the country. So if they were going to promote their new documentary on Save the Whales or Raising the Mammoth or whatever it was, they had the advantage of promoting it in such a way that, Wednesday night at 9, it didn't matter where you are, go to Discovery and that's what you're going to see. PBS was never able to do that because all of their stations program independently. So if they had a show, they would send it out, say, here we've got, a new Masterpiece Theater, run it when you want. So in Cleveland, you'd see it at 8 o'clock Tuesday, and Atlanta, you'd see it at 9 o'clock Friday, and there's no coherence to it. So they came up with this idea for what's called the National Programming Service. And basically that was an attempt to compete with the national networks, both primarily cable, but also the commercial networks, in terms of having a coherent and consistent national schedule. So if they were going to run the Civil War series, it would be seen everywhere at the same time, and they could promote the heck of it in the same way. It also meant that they could begin to develop some larger programs, put more money into fewer but more select programs, in terms of also competing with the discoveries of the world. So that was when we did begin to get